Today is Thursday, August 10th, 2006. I am Sarah Locker. It is a pleasure to conduct this interview for the Dakota Memories Oral History Project in Wishick, North Dakota. Can you just state your full name for me, please?
Arthur Bender.
And what do you know about your family and your family's history? You said that you know some stuff about your grandparents and...
Well, I'd have to start with my grandparents lived in somewhere in Germany, and then the Russian made some offer to the German princess for people to move to a country, and they would let them farm there and let them raise cattle and teach the Russians some of the traits that the Germans knew about raising crops and cattle. And so my grandfather and his family moved down there to this, and I don't know the name of that little country. And so they said that you won't be subject to be drafted, you won't have to pay taxes, and a few other things. It sounded real good to those German people, so they moved in there. And so my grandparents settled in around Kassel, South Russia, is where they settled in. And it wasn't long, and what they had said about not having to go to the army was a lie, and he was drafted. And he spent 7 years in the Russian army, and I never could figure out how, but he built himself up in rank to where he was like the same as a colonel in the army. He was not a staff sergeant or a regular sergeant. He was like a colonel. And so these officers had to have a dog with him, a killer dog they had in their hand around his neck, because the privates would kill the officers. They hated the officers. And him being a German and an officer in the Russian army, he was hated by the Russians and hated by the Germans. That's the way it went. And so he had worked himself up. What puzzles me that the Russians would let this German go ahead and get to be an officer, which is a fairly high rank. And so that now he was helping make the rules. And anyway, but after he was serving there, and he had served 7 years, and then, of course, all the things they had promised him were not fulfilled. They paid taxes, and they were drafted. And so one night when he came home on a furlough, he came home on a furlough, and one of the cows had broken through the fence. The fence was bad somewhere, and one cow broke through into the neighbor's cow herd. Well, my grandfather's father, whose name was John Bender, he was an older man, he went to get that cow back, and they got into such an argument with that Russian that the Russian killed him. So that's how our great-grandfather was killed in Russia, because that guy said, "That's not your cow, it's my cow." And they saw where the cow had broke the fence and went in, and she was a different color than the other. But the guy said, "That's my cow." And in the ensuing argument, he killed John Bender. So then, when my grandfather came home on a furlough, they said, "This is enough." They had now 3 children, my father and 2 of his sisters, and they were ranking from 3 years to 4 years and 5 years, something like that. they said, we're going to leave. We're going to try and escape here. And they found out about some Jewish guy somewhere who made false passports. And so he made them a false passport for him and his wife and his 3 children, and for $3. And so they came, they had these false passports, and now they had a house and a yard, and they had some cows, and they had a couple of teams of horses and buggy and whatever, and household furnishings. They couldn't take anything. They couldn't sell anything. They'd say, oh, they're going to take off. So they had to leave everything. So they walked away from the house at night, and this was all prearranged. A ship was coming in the Black Sea in the middle of the night, and anybody that rowed out there or got out there somehow with the little boat, they loaded them in the ship, and the ship went back. In the morning, the ship was gone, and the people were gone. And that's where my grandfather and my grandmother and those 3 little kids got on and left. And so when they were on the ship, well, they said, there's some charges here for going to America. Well, they said, we haven't got any money. We have $50. And I don't know in whose exchange, but $50 they had. And the ship captain said, well, we'll not take your last $50, but you and your wife have to work on the ship. So they scrubbed and whatever had to be done on the ship, both. And of course they had these 3 little kids to watch. And all they could bring was, she had a little roll of clothes for the girls under her arm, and he had a little roll, an extra little coat for my dad, who was 6 years old or something like that. That's all they could take in possessions. And so now they're working on this boat. And finally they arrive at New York. And they couldn't speak a word of English, not one word. And so they get to New York, and they said, well, where do you want to go to? Well, they didn't know even what they asked them. So there were people there who could speak German. They said, they're German, and let me talk to them. They said, where do you want to go to? And they said, we want to go to Eureka. Well, what Eureka? There's 4 Eurekas in the United States. Well, they don't know which one. And then they said, well, what did they do at this Eureka you want to go to? Well, they said they have cattle and they milk a few cows and they farm a little bit. They have a little land and they farm a little. And this person said, that's got to be Eureka, South Dakota. Because one Eureka is in California, and I don't remember where the other 2 are. We don't have no information, but somehow somebody put them on the train headed to Eureka. Now, who paid the fare for the train? They had only those $50. And they still had them when they got to Eureka, South Dakota. They had those $50 yet. But they got on that train and they came to Eureka one day. Then they said, well, where do our relatives live who came earlier? Well, they said there were some vendors here, but they went way north of Eureka someplace. They moved way north. Well, they said, how are we going to find them? Well, they didn't know. So they asked the man, could we buy a couple of horses from you and a buggy? Well, he says, I got one horse here, that's $50. And the other horse, well, I'll throw in the other horse, he says. But he says, what about buggy? Well, he said, there's an old one sitting over there, I'll let you have that. So for $50, all they had no other money. For $50, they bought the 2 horses and the buggy, and they packed into that horse and buggy, and they headed north. And 10 miles north of Eureka, here were the relatives. You see how 10 miles was way up north someplace. And so they met the relatives there who had earlier moved. And that was in that area where one brother lived in one place half a mile up. A sister married a Mr. Kramer from Linton. And they had a big family, and those Kramers all moved to Linton, North Dakota, and had businesses there. And then another half mile north of there is where my grandfather moved to with the kids. And so now they were established in a little farm north of Eureka, but they had no friends except these close relatives who lived a half a mile away. And but he had a good friend in the army, also a German, who was drafted by the name of Meidinger. And this Meidinger lived over in a place called the Berlin Settlement, which is not Berlin, North Dakota, it's Berlin Baptist area where a bunch of Baptist people had a church, and it's known as the Berlin Settlement, northeast of Ashland, North Dakota. So they moved there, or they questioned, well, how? This friend said, if you only lived closer, if we come from our place to where you live, that's a day's travel. Then we visit a while, and then a day's travel back again. That's so far. And pretty soon, they were looking around for a place by Lair, North Dakota, and found one, and they moved there from that area where they had been. And so now they were about 8 miles apart from each other. So every Sunday, either this family went down to the other family to visit, or the next Sunday that family came up to them to visit. And each had now 10, 12 kids. They always said, oh, if our kids would just love each other, that our kids would marry. We're such good friends. They were army buddies. That Mr. Meidinger was not a big officer, but he was in the same army. And they just kept saying, oh, if our kids would marry. They never did. They didn't like each other for some reason. But their children, grandchildren of this Mr. Bender and Mr. Meidinger, they got married. And that was me and a Meidinger girl, my first wife, her mother was married to a wolf. She was a wolf, but her mother was a Meidinger. From that family, so now the second generation was married because the other didn't make it work. And anyway, that's where we came into the picture then. But I wanted to go back a little. When he was in the army, my grandfather and this other man, there was a private there who was also a German, and he particularly hated my grandfather because he was a German and was a Russian officer, and he was doing the Russian bidding. He had to. He was to give him orders. He hated him. And like we said earlier, he was hated by the Germans and by the Russians. He moves to this area in north of Eureka. Well, it's the place we were talking about earlier, where you
on just north of Ventura on 11, where
yeah,
the family farm's at.
Yes, and this pretty soon he comes to that little town of Ventura, which is about 6 miles to town. Here's this man, this private, that hated him so much. He too came to America, and he lived straight north of Ventura, from where our farm was this morning, just 2 miles south. That's where he lived. And that never went away till they died, that the grandfather of these people that were our neighbors now. And my grandfather, he hated him because he was a private. He had to take orders from another German who was now a Russian officer giving orders that he didn't like. And so that's interesting that they moved all the way to America. They moved within 6 or 7 miles from each other, didn't know it. Anyway, so much for that. Now, my parents grew up. My dad grew up on that place north of Eureka. That's where they really grew up. And so then, pretty soon, they were old enough to get married. And my dad told me some of these things. He said, you didn't go out and look for a girl. The parents drove down the road a mile or 2 or 3 and said, those people have girls, and we've got a boy or a couple of boys, and they'd drive in the yard and just say, what do you think? You think we can make a deal? And my dad said his folks took him to a home like that. And he said, I knew of these girls already. And I said, Dad, I don't want nothing to do with these girls. And they couldn't understand it. It's a girl, and you're looking for a girl. We're looking for a wife for you. But he said, not that one, because of evidently the character of these girls. So pretty soon, they drove a little further. And pretty soon they came to the farmyard where my grandmother was a girl, 2 miles out of Venturia, North Dakota. And so pretty soon, okay, we'll get married. And so they got married, and they decided, well, my father had Fred Bender now. We were talking about Fred Bender. My father had come north of Venturia, and the same thing, they said, way north of Venturia, he bought a place. He bought a quarter of land, and he built a barn on it. They said, from miles away, they said, how can we find that place? They said, just drive north of Venturia. From miles away, you'll see a big red barn. That's the place. And then he finally found that house up north, 2 miles north of his barn. He farmed 1 year without a house. He had some grain and farmed a little. Well, then they got married, and they bought this other quarter, and that had that little house, 2-room house. So they moved that little 2-room house with about 14 horses or 16 horses on the bunch of wagons. They put the house on these wagon beds, and about 16 horses, and they brought it down 2 miles and set it down. And that's where their first 4 children were born, in this 2-room house. And so then I want to go back to when they got married. Then they said, well, we got to get your stuff up there. And they didn't call a van to back up and load their stuff up. There was nothing like that. They took what we call a header box. And the reason it's called a header box, it's a box built low on one side and high on the other side. And the header had an elevator on it. The header cut the grain, and then it came to this elevator, and that elevated it up into that low side of the box. And then they stacked it in there till it was full, and then they unloaded. Well, they said, we'll use that header box, and they put their bedding in, and what they had very little things, but they put some bedding in, and maybe a table or whatever they had, clothes, and so my mother's brother, younger brother, he said, I'll drive the wagon up for you. Halfway up, a thunderstorm came along, and it got so bad, the wind was so bad, that high side of the header box, the wind come from there and threw it over upside down. Well, as a result, my uncle, my mother's brother, had a badly broken leg and something else, I don't know. And so they set everything up again, loaded everything back into that old header box, and moved in here. So then, now they lived up here 7 miles north of Venturia. No roads, just a country road, trudging along. And so then 4 of their children were born, including me, born in this little 2-room house. And when I said 2-room, it had 1 room was the kitchen and the where you walked in, the porch, the kitchen part. And then there was another room that was the front room. They call it the Stube in German. That meant the front room. And there they had a Davenport that you could make into a bed. And I remember those they were wooden framed outsides and kind of leather, made out of leather and a little. Anyway, at night they'd roll this thing over and make a bed out of it. And then 2 or 3 of us slept in that bed. And behind, in that stube, there was a little opening just big enough to have their bed in there and a curtain pulled down. So that's where they slept. So it was really a 2-room house with that little deal made off for a bedroom. Well, anyway, while they were living there, one of those little boys got sick. The second one born, first son, and then another son, and he got real sick. So they took him to a doctor, and the doctors didn't have much knowledge of what they were doctoring. And they said, he's so sick, I don't think we can save him. But take him to Bismarck. As sick as he was, my dad got him on the train in Danzig, North Dakota. That was 6 miles from us, east and north. And there they got from there to Wishick, North Dakota, and up with the train to Bismarck. They were up there 2 or 3 days. And the boy got sicker and sicker. And they finally said, well, I don't think we can save him. And pretty soon he died. And all that was wrong, they found out later. He had pneumonia. They didn't know how to treat pneumonia in those days. And so he died. Well, then my folks had 3 kids left. Me, the youngest boy, and a sister in between, and the oldest son. And so then, after a number of years, they said, we need a bigger house. This is just too small. So they planned, and I remember, I was about 4 years old. I remember when we'd run from the 2-room house straight across to the garage to get the old Model T out and go to church. And now all of a sudden, they said, we're going to build a house here. And they said, but we want a well. We want to drill a well. We want water in this house. So they drilled the well, the old horse-drawn well digger that the horses went around in a circle and round and round. They drilled that. 60 feet down, they found water, good water. So then they cleaned that mud up, that dirt away, and then they built the house within the well within that house in the corner. And then everything was scraped out with horses and what they call scrapers, dirt scrapers out of the basement. And they built the basement, and then that corner had to be dug up by hand because the well was there. And so they dug that all out by hand and finally built the house on there. So 2 years or so, they just had a pump in there, pump handle. You pumped yourself some water. And then they said, well, we really had planned to put running water in this house. But I don't know if it was the finances or what, but for 2 years they pumped water and carried it wherever they wanted to go. Pretty soon they put a sink on the ground floor. And in the basement, all they had was a hole in the sewer, a sewer hole. When you washed dishes and stuff, or a slop pail, you went over to that hole, you poured it in, and it ran out to the sewer. Well, anyway, then they put a sink upstairs. Of course, nobody touched that upstairs. That was special. They lived in the basement. And then they put pipes up to the second floor. And there they put a bathtub and hot and cold running water. And the hot water was made hot by pipes running into the furnace and coming back out of a storage tank. And when in the winter you had lots of hot water, in the summer you had none because you weren't using the furnace and heating that up. So anyway, people said, oh, those Benders are rich. They've got a 19-room house. They've got running water. They've got electricity. They're rich. And many, many years later, I found out that the total cost of the house, the running water, piping, the well, everything, the electricity was 32 volt with a motor in the basement to run. I found out that the total cost was $6,000, which was in those days big money. But people said they're rich, they got all those fine things, you know. But $6,000 is all it cost. Today, a house like that would cost $300,000, $250,000 for sure. $300,000, probably closer to it. But anyway, then they lived in that house for a couple of years or so, 3 maybe. And then I was growing up and I was 5 years old, and I was always wanting to go to school. My older sister and my older brother were going to school, and they says, you can't go, you're not old enough. And I'd scream and holler and cry and every morning practically. But one day, they said, they called me Arthur Arthur in German. Arthur, you can go to school today. Boy, did I jump, run, and got my nicest little suitie that I could wear and put that on. They took me to school with the Model T. Our dad took us with the Model T to school. It was November 9th, and it was raining that day. When I was born, it was raining, cats and dogs. But anyway, this was now 4 years later, 5 years later. Anyway, the evening, I thought, that's funny, Dad is coming to get us again with a Model T. We could have walked to him. Of course, I had this little art along, 5 years old. So he brought us home and in the house, and before we got off the Model T, we saw, there's Grandma's little buggy. Is Grandma here? Yeah, he says, she's here. So she had one of these two-wheel buggy with one horse. I don't know what they called them, a shay or something. And she was there. And I walked in and up the stairs to the ground floor. My goodness, my mother is in bed. Down here, we all slept upstairs. She's in the company extra bedroom we had for company. She's in bed. And grandmother's here and sitting there. And my dad sat down and I said, "Was ist los? What's wrong?" I thought, why is she so sick? And then they said, "Come over here." They had an apple box standing there beside the bed. And I thought, why is that apple box standing here in front of the bed? They said, "Look in there. Guck mal nein." Look into that, in German. Look into that apple box. And I kept poofing, what would be in an apple box? Why am I supposed to look in the apple box? I walked over, looked in, and here lay this little thing, red, big red face and a wrinkle on the nose. And I said, "What is it?" I was so shocked I didn't know. "Well," they said, "that's your baby sister." "No." I says, "No." He says, "Yeah." And I says in German, "Wo kommt die her?" Where is she coming from? And I've told this story many places. But I said, we were taught all our lives to tell the truth and be honest. And my dad looked at my mother and they both smiled a little and they said, "Grandma brought her in that little black suitcase that's sitting over there." And I've told this story at many places, and I said, I believed that till I was about 16. Anyway, that was my youngest sister then, which Irene, which is married to Elmer Schauer, and Elmer has passed away since then. So that's the family up to there. And then, of course, we all went to grade school, walked to school, and walked home and walked down. So one day, the weather was kind of nasty, and our dad came with the sled. I thought, that's pretty nice. So when we got home, he let us off in front of the house. We threw our books in the house, took our little sled and slid down the snowbanks for half an hour or so. He says, "If you can do that, you can walk home from school." From then on, we walked again, which some of those lessons were hard. But we graduated from school, and everybody was working, And in the summer, when we headered, the whole family was out there. The dad would run the header, and I had to run the team. I wasn't old enough to look over that slanted bar. I could look across here like this, and I had the lines to run the team with the wagon. But a lot of times that didn't work out too good. I either got too close or too far away, and sometimes things didn't go good. But my mother was stacking the grain where the stack they were making, and somebody pitched a load, and later my brother got old enough, about 16, 17, he pitched the load. And that's how we headed and got the crop cut. Later on, we bindered everything. Then we all went out shocking, the whole family. Mother, dad, my two sisters, and I, and my brother. And that was a lot of hard work. But a lot of that was done all together. The whole family did something. And then seeding in the spring, that's another thing people took offense to. We had an old drill to seed, and my dad said, "We've got to buy another drill. It takes us too long with that old 10-foot drill with horses." So we bought a new drill, brought it home in the snowstorm, got stuck with it in the field because the discs from the drill dragged snow, and we had to shovel the drill out. And we thought, why do we have to bring it home when there's this much snow? But we did. And so then we were seeding with 2 drills. My dad and I followed each other, and we had a system that the front one pulled away and the second one turned around, got in his place. Then that one come around like this. When we came up, the other one turned aside. We had a system. We seeded a lot of land that way with 2 drills. And they says, look, they're so rich they got 2 drills. We got 1. And I mean, it was a necessity. We had more land and 1 drill could seed. And then pretty soon, somebody had a drill with a hitch on it, and you could put a tractor on, and you could go like blazes down the field seeding with that. Now that changed things considerably. And so on it went. Rock picking, we picked rocks. As soon as seeding was done, we picked rocks for close to a month. Every field had to be picked. We walked, had a wagon, pitched them all on the wagon, took them to a rock pile and pitched them off there. And the day the rock picker came along with that he got pulled by, that was much, much different. And then the thrashing was another thing. The thrash machine somebody had a thrash machine, they'd move in and they would have 10 bundle wagons or 12, and they'd pitch bundles and make a big straw stack, and we hauled the grain home and pitched it in by hand into the granary. And then the women were inside pitching it back further. And along with that, they were running in to watch the cooking so that 12 people can be fed in the evening. And so there's a lot of hard work through there. But I don't know if I can do that now, but I forgot something with my grandpa in Russia. I would like to. He told us a story that they had a wagon and 2 horses, good running horses, and he had to go someplace, and it went through, they called it a wald, which is a forest, but it was probably a group of trees, and 1 wagon track through there to get to wherever they were going. And they had a lot of big wolves in Russia. And he said pretty soon 3 or 4 wolves were coming along, howling and running and trying to jump onto the wagon or jump at the horses. He says, I stood in the wagon and used the whip and just whipped the horses, galloping as fast as I could. And one of the wolves accidentally got under the wagon, under the wheel, and he killed one. And he says, I hit one with the whip. He was jumping towards my horse, and I hit him with that big, long whips. He says, I hit him, and he fell over. Couldn't get jump on my horse. But he says, if they'd have jumped on our horses, they'd have killed the horses and killed me. But that was something he said that was always fearful when you drive through that little woods stretch. The wolves, the timber wolves, were waiting for him. And that was something. And in those days, I never heard them say anything that they had a gun. They could have maybe shot some, but that was a very scary thing for him. He said, I could have been killed. And at the horses, they said they would jump on horses' backs. They'd come, take a running jump on their backs and grab them by the neck, and they'd kill them. So that was something I wanted to tell that my grandfather talked about. Now, I never met my grandfather. He died 2 years before I was born. But some of that was passed on through the grandmother and through my dad. And then my dad also said about the thrashing in their day, this was way early when he was still single. And then Sundays they'd have, nobody worked on Sunday. So they'd all meet the guys at a blacksmith shop at some guy's house. And I said to him, well, what did the guys do? Well, the biggest thing was fight. Guy would look at another one and say, I think I can lick you. They weren't mad at each other. And they'd beat each other half to death until one guy gave up, or they pulled him apart. And he said, one time, he says, they were in this blacksmith shop, and my dad, he was tall and heavy, and they said, we're going to gang up, we're going to beat up that bender today. They were going to go like 4 or 5 guys. And he says, I had no other choice. I grabbed the blacksmith hammer. And he says, I beat around on the iron and stuff. And I says, come over here, come over here. And they ran out the door. He says, I thought I'm going to get killed today. But he scared them by, they saw he meant business with that hammer. But they weren't mad at each other. They just wanted to, that was their entertainment. And I says, didn't guys have dates and take girls buggy riding? Not very often, he says. A few of those gals went around with men and all of a sudden they were pregnant. Back then, But he says, most people got married by the parents, drove to a house and said, we got a boy and you got a girl, and what do you think? And that's the way it went. Yeah. Okay.
How are we doing on time? 42 minutes. Okay. Well, you've talked a lot about your parents and the stories they've shared. But what was your father like himself? What kind of a man was he?
Spiritually, or what are you talking?
All around, how would you describe him?
He was an honest man. Very honest. He taught us from day one, don't cheat and don't lie. That's why I'm I said my mother and dad both told a fib, but they couldn't very well tell this 5-year-old how it really happened. But he taught us always keep straight, be honest, tell the truth, do a good day's work. But he was also very stern. We learned some hard lessons till we finally shaped up. But he got to be 78 years old, and he was an old man. It seemed like he walked so hunched over. Now I'm just about 84, and I don't feel like that. I'm that old.
If you and your brothers and sisters were being mischievous and getting in trouble, who would discipline you?
Both, but mostly my dad. I know I did something wrong one time, and I don't remember the details. And my dad came around the corner of the granary and saw it. And he says, he started coming towards me, and I started to take off. He says, wait till I get there so I can spank you. That was tough to stand there for, seemed like 20 minutes till he walked 15 steps. And then I got a spanking, and then it was over. And our mother, if we did something wrong, she was not as stern, but if we needed punishing, she chased me up the stairs one time in this new house when I was about 9 years old for something I did. And I'd have got away, but I couldn't get the door open. And she caught me, so she spanked me good, and then she helped me open the door.
That always works. What is your fondest memory of your dad?
I don't know. I'd have to think about that. There were a lot of fond memories. I was proud of his honesty, and he never tried to cheat anybody. And he was active in the church. He stood for what was right. And
If you did something that your father was proud of, was happy of, would he tell you? How would he share that? Would he tell you did a good job?
uh, I think if you're old enough, you remember that in those days, it was hard for old people to say you did a good job. They couldn't say it. They knew it. They meant it. But to say you did a good job, I have to say that came rarely. But in the end, it sometimes came anyway. But it was hard. You have to understand that German-Russian background. It was hard to give praise to somebody, especially a son or a daughter.
What was your mother like?
Oh, she was kind, and she worked very hard. She sewed all the clothes for her and her daughters, and fixed patched up our pants, one patch on top of the other patch, and make them last. And we were poor during the 30s. Everybody was poor, and I said to my dad, I need new shoes. I had a hole about this big in the bottom of the sole. I was walking on my bare foot. Stocking had worn off. He says, we haven't got money. So we cut a big, out of a cardboard box we bought, cut a piece that fit into there. And then when it fit nice, then they made copies of it, about 3 of them. I'd wear that for about 2-3 days, and it was shot. Took this one out, put another one in. Finally, I got a new pair of shoes. You saved those. You kept them clean because you didn't have too many extras. That was by necessity. They had to sometimes do some strange things.
Do you remember any other hardships from the 30s that your family had to endure?
Well, because of his honesty, he went to the bank one time and he said, I can't pay my bill. He says, we just can't this year. Well, he said, did I ask for payment? Well, no. Well, he says, I know that you didn't have a crop out there. I know that drought in 33, the drought ate up everything. He says, when you got money, you pay. And that was, some of those people could have wiped us out and said, well, I got this mortgage, bing, you're out. But they were also honest people. Some of those bankers were very good. One time, oh yes, everybody had a bike but I. Everybody came bicycling, and I said, Dad, I'd like a bicycle too. He said, he didn't use that very often, but he said, lieber Gott, loving God, we haven't got no money. So I waited another year. One day, we went to town to Ashley, and had a nice bicycle sitting there. I think it was like $60 or $55, $60. And I said, Dad, couldn't we buy this bicycle? We haven't got no money. We haven't got $60. And the guy that run the shop was a good friend of my dad's. He says, come on, wouldn't you buy that bicycle for your son? Well, he says, we haven't got the money. Well, how much money you got? My dad looked at me and he said, how much money you got? I opened my billfold. I said, I got $5. That man said, that's enough. Down payment. We took that bicycle home. Every month, my dad took me to Ashley, and I had to pay $5 every month till it was paid for.
How did you get the $5 every month?
Oh, sometimes a quarter from Grandma, but I managed somehow. I managed to get $5, and my dad made me pay for it, not him.
Then it was your bike.
Yeah.
So, what lessons do you think you've taken with you from your parents? What's been a lasting impression on you from them?
One thing I have to say, I learned honesty from my father. Even if it cost him some money, he says, but that's not right. We got to do it this way. This is honest. And sometimes we felt he was a little too strong-armed with us. But as we got older, we learned that was a good lesson for us. And we turned out different than we might have.
We've talked a lot about your brothers and sisters. Can you give them to me in order, though, of oldest to youngest for your brothers and sisters?
Yes. Walter was the oldest. And he has since passed away. But he died at 88 years old. And he was the first one that naturally had to go to school. And he had not learned any English from anybody because at home everything was German. And it was very tough for him to get started. And then after he came home with school papers and stuff, my sister, who was next in line, and we could start skimming around in those books. And when we went to school, it wasn't quite as tough, but it was still tough because we couldn't speak any English. They wouldn't allow us to speak any German, and we couldn't speak very much English. I remember one thing when I was in about fourth or fifth grade maybe, and a boy who was the same age, but he was a year under me in grade school for some reason. He was a fifth grader, and he cried and cried and cried all day. And the teacher was a very hot-tempered woman. She came and she says, "What's the matter with you? What's the matter with you?" And he couldn't say what was the matter with him. And she yelled and yelled at him, and he kept crying and crying. And finally, it got so bad. Finally, she threw up her hands. She says, "I don't know what's the matter with him." She was Norwegian or Swedish and spoke English, and our kids could not speak English, and they couldn't say it in German. I have to stop here and say that our school board were very stupid in bringing school teachers who are Swedish and Norwegian background who speak English and cannot speak German, because these are all German kids. They should have hired a girl or a boy who can speak, doesn't have to speak it necessarily, but can understand what the problem is. And of course she didn't. And so anyway, she threw her hands up. "I don't know what's the matter with him." And he just hollered and screamed and cried. Finally, when she walked back to the desk, he leaned over to me in German. He said, "How do you say toothache?" He told me, ich hab Zahnweh. That's toothache. So she came back and she says, "I don't know what to do with it." Well, I said, I raised my hand and she was mad at everybody already. "What do you want now?" And I said, "He's got a bad toothache." "Well, why doesn't he tell me that?" I says, "Teacher, he can't. He doesn't know what the word toothache." He just asked me how to say toothache. That's what he's got. Well, she says, "Get out of here. Go on home." Middle of the afternoon, she sent him home with his toothache. But you know, that's one thing. It would have been so easy if the teacher could understand German. If she's going to work in a German community, she should be able to understand it, maybe not necessarily speak it, to help these kids. And so, because I knew what to say, how to say toothache, then it was settled. But a lot of these things, the school board did very poor thinking. They hired some gal from Fargo or someplace to move in here, and she couldn't handle those German kids, German-speaking kids. And so some of that was tragic. And of course, in school, there's always competition, and there were 6 of us in my grade, and I'm not trying to brag, but as soon as we had our lesson assigned to us, so say for instance arithmetic, when we had the lesson done, she assigned for tomorrow. Well, when I had a little time, I did my arithmetic for tomorrow. It isn't called arithmetic today, but and first recess come along, the guy said, "I suppose you already got your arithmetic ready for tomorrow." I says, "Yeah, I did mine." They said, "We haven't even gotten around to that yet." And some didn't even have it ready the next day. But it was a big difference in ability or whatever it was. But one, he couldn't get anything right. He'd come, either he'd say, "I forgot it," or "I haven't got it." One of those things. And in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, you don't say you haven't got it because you're going to get nailed. Anyway, it gets around to writing our 8th grade test for graduation, and that was a whole afternoon of studying, of writing and stuff, and so it was down to 3 subjects: arithmetic, geography, and I don't remember what the other one was. But we all sat down and did our tests. So the 6 of us, 5 of us got done finally and went home. And this guy stayed until it got just about dark. And the next morning, or when we got to school, he had passed. You know well enough. All these years he didn't have it or forgot it or couldn't figure it out. But she thought, what the heck am I going to do with him? Either she helped him with the answers or something, but he passed. Just barely passed, but he passed. And then, by the same token, she did my arithmetic. And guess what my score was? 98.5. She said, "I had to take 1.5 off for something. He had to write, but something how I did something." But she said, "I had to take 1.5 off." And then, as it turned out, then we had the 8th grade graduation class in Ashland, the courthouse. And they had, from the whole county, they had all the 8th graders that graduated. 4 of them had to give long pieces in, get up there in front of that whole crowd and give a long piece. By memory, I was one. But I just did what I could, and it turned out all right. And over the years, these other guys were they were actually jealous. But I mean, I didn't try to outdo them. I just studied till I knew what I needed. And so in school, there were guys that were my age, but they were 2 grades behind me for one reason or another. And most of the time they couldn't handle it. But we finally all graduated, and I don't know of anyone that flunked, except, I shouldn't say that, my brother never graduated from the 8th grade. He just couldn't get it all straight. And finally, the time was up, and the school was up, and my dad says, "You're not going another year." And so he never graduated from the 8th grade. But I did. And so did my other 2 sisters.
Was education important to your family?
Because of the change from German to English, it seemed that it was not that important to them. They wanted to get done, get home, and haul hay and haul manure and do the farming. But he never, he didn't say, "I won't let you go to school. We could go to school." But when I said high school, with a loud voice, he said, "High school? We got hay to haul, we got cattle to feed, we got milking to do." Then I'd had to been in town. I couldn't be at home milking. And so I would have just loved. The teachers drove out from from Wishick to the farm and talked to my folks and to me. "We'd like you." They knew I had good grades. "We'd like you to come to high school." Not a chance. So then when I was 38 years old, I had a couple of kids work for me, and one of them, at fall, they'd always go home and go to school or do something else. I didn't need them in the wintertime. This one kid said, I said, "You got 1 more year in high school." "I'm not going back." He says, "I'm not going back." I says, "For 1 more year, you certainly want to finish that and get done." "No, he's not going back." He says, "My folks need the money so bad, I'm going to work for you all winter." Well, I hadn't planned to hire him at all. But I felt guilty when he said the folks need the money so bad. And he was only getting like $50 a month, I think he saw, or something. So I finally talked to him. I says, "If you're not going to go to high school, there's a place in Allendale. Today you can get it in Ashley and all over, but there's a place in the Allendale that used to have the college there. And you can write those tests, and if you pass them, you graduate. You don't have to go to..." "No, I wouldn't pass anyway." He says, "Oh, I'm not going." And finally, I talked to him. Finally, he says, "Well, all right, let's drive down." So I drove down 60 miles. We looked the professor up, and he gave us the instructions. Three tests, 3 different things you have to write on. And if you pass them, you get your diploma. Well, he wasn't very enthused about it, but we made an appointment. That day, I think the next day, we come back down. We do chores early in the morning, drive down there 60 miles, write the test, come home and do the chores again. But so we went down, and he said, "You can only write 5 tests, 5 you have to write. You can only write 3 one day and 2 the next day." So I did that. We did 3 the first day, and the next day we drove down again and did 2 others. And when we were done, he went in the office, professor, and half hour or so he came out and he says, I don't know how to tell you this. I got good news and bad news. He said, the boy flunked and you made it. That was, to me, that was good news. And he out and lit a cigarette and smoked just as fast as he could and beside the car. And we talked a while and he said, well, maybe you can get him to go again. He passed 3, but 2 he missed. And he wouldn't think of it. Not on your life am I going to go back. So anyway, pretty soon I get my diploma in the mail, high school diploma. And he never made it. He never. But that was when, I tried to help him. I just for fun, I said, how about, can I write it too on the way out? If you got $10, you can write it. And I did. So that I felt good about that. And my dad couldn't understand that. How can you pass high school now? You're 38 years old. How can you pass it now? I said, I'd have passed it if you'd have let me go to high school when I was that age. But now and I said to him, what should I study? To the professor, what books should I read? He said, you could read 5 or 10 books. If you read all the wrong books, he says, it's a general information, general things that you should know if you graduated from high school. Well, I managed. And then he said something else that made me feel good. Mr. Bender, he said, you didn't just pass. You didn't just slip by. You had good grades all the way through, he said. So I felt good about that. Never changed my lifestyle. My program was set up and I was farming and cattle and everything. Never changed none, but I knew it here. I graduated. Yeah.
So, I know you were a good student in grade school. Were you ever a little mischievous in high school?
Well, I know.
Get in trouble?
I wasn't in high school.
Or I'm sorry, in grade school.
Well, as kids, not that I deliberately wanted to do something to hurt somebody, but we had a big ball about this high, and we'd run and give it a good kick. And I and another boy ran, and I got ready to kick, and he had notion he's going to drop himself on that ball. And he did, and I kicked him. He missed the ball, but I kicked him in the stomach. Oh, did he scream and holler. I'd stay in after school about 3 days, I think, every recess. I didn't get to go out. That was a mistake. I apologized. I said, I didn't mean to kick you. I tried to kick the ball. And he threw himself just the last second before I kicked. He threw himself on the ball and bang, I kicked him right in here. That's about the only trouble that I was in high school or in school. That teacher sometimes told us to quiet down and stuff like that. But I think that's the only time I ever had to stay in for anything.
What kind of games would you play at recess?
A lot of times we played baseball, but we didn't know the rules. We just batted and caught them and chased the ball. And we didn't really know the rules. And baseball was a big thing. And then we had another one they called pom-pom pull-away. Did you ever play that?
Mm-mm.
Well, they all lined up and then they'd run. One guy hollers, pom-pom pull-away, and they all run off. I don't really know how it goes anymore. And then some lose out, and then until finally it's down to 2 or 3 guys, the girls. That was played a lot, but baseball was probably the most, or chasing each other, playing catch, or Andy over sometimes we played over the coal shed. And the coal shed and the bathrooms were all one building. Bathrooms were side by side, and the girls on one side, the boys on one side. Behind it was the coal shed. One spring, all of a sudden the girls screamed and screamed and screamed, and I thought, don't tell me one of those, the foundation was pretty bad, maybe one of the guys was trying to peek in there or something. I don't know. They screamed so loud. I thought, what in the world happened? And she came running out, and she said, "There's a gopher down there, where they're, at their side of the stool." And she wasn't going to do her job with that gopher down there. And one time the teacher was watching the baseball game and was backing to school, backing back to the school like this. And mischievous I was, I snuck over there, knelt down behind her. She went end over the top of me. She was a little mad that day. But I don't think I was punished. She finally laughed anyway, but she was backing up and over, and she went. That's about all I can remember. That we never got a whipping or a spanking or anything.
You stayed home from high school in order to work out on the farm. Did you only work on the farm, or did you also get hired out to neighborhood farms?
No, we didn't until 1938, when we had no crop. There was just nothing, and so our dad said, "I found out you could hire out to some people in Lisbon and the surrounding little towns there to earn a little money." And so my older brother was going to go, and I begged. I was only 16, I think. I was 15 or 16. Ah, no, okay, let you go too. So he took us up there to Lisbon, dropped us off there. They had a place where you could get hired. And so I got a job just a mile or two out of Lisbon, and my brother got a job further north in another little town. And that's not far, but maybe 10, 15 miles up. So we worked about 2 weeks, and then my brother, somehow somebody came down and they looked me up at where I worked. We hadn't seen each other for 2 weeks, and we talked a little bit, and finally I said, "Well, we'll work 2 more weeks and then we'll go home." And so we worked there. My boss his father had committed suicide. And so my boss was 19 years old or 20 and was running the farm. And his mother was there and 2 sisters. And they milked like 16 cows. And you think those sisters would come out and help? He and I got up before sunup in summer, that's early. He sent me east to get the cows down a hill and up. And after I brought the cows in and into the east door of the barn, then the sun came peeking up. So that was about 5 o'clock or so. We milked those 16 cows, fed a few pigs and a few calves, then came in and ate, and then we went to worked like dogs. And then at noon, they had a little quick meal. Everybody had one little piece of meat, and it was gone. And the supper, then we had a little more. Milk those cows again. We eat supper at 11, 10:30, 11. Well, in a month, when we got home, my mother weighed me. She said, "You lost 21 pounds." Because the hard work and skimpy little food, they were Swedish, and that's not because they were Swedish. They were just the way they cooked. It wasn't enough for a growing boy. And like one night there were 6 of us eating, and they had 7 pieces of pork chop. Each took one, and then they looked at me. They said, "Art, would you like that other one?" Boy, because I was a growing boy, and we worked full hours from sun up till 11 at night. Those are big hours. He lost 21 pounds. So we went home, and my dad, or my mother told me later, that Dad came home. He had just hauled his 2 boys away, and he said they were happy to get a job. And we got home, and he, at home, started up the header, and my older sister, and him, I don't know who the third one was, but they headed a few little valleys in the fields where there was a little wheat. So they had 1 stack of headered hay to harvest. I think we got 50 bushels or something wheat, of 500 acres of wheat or barley and stuff. When we got back, we thrashed that. But we worked hard, and we got, I think I got $5 a day, which is not very much. And my brother got a little more. And when we got home, I had around $65 or so, and Walter had $70 or $75. So they took part of the money and put a head on our John Deere. The head was shot. That cost about $80. Fixed the head up so we had the tractor to run next spring again. And my money went, they crawled up the windmill and put a new head on the windmill. The head was shot. There's where the money went. We had nothing. We didn't get any money. Oh, we spent a little money like ice cream and stuff on Saturday nights and stuff. But those were tough days. If it wasn't for the fact that we went and worked out there, and then he had some friend come from Danzig who was kind of a mechanic. He put that all together on the tractor so that it would run again. And the windmill, my brother and somebody else crawled up and they put that new head up there. That was a job and a half. I could never crawl any heights. I'm scared of heights. But my brother and some other guy, I don't know who that was no more, they fixed that head so that those 2 things were what we needed to fix. We needed money for them, and we didn't have it. And that year, 38, and then in 39, we got a half a crop or so. I know my dad said when we thrashed, he says, I went down to the horses and I gave them each a half a bucket of oats. They hadn't gotten any in 5 years, he said. Boy, did they eat that oats, he said. And then the following at 40, we had a pretty good crop then. And 41, there were some good crops then. But we had those bad years, 33, 34, 35. Oh, boy, we had nothing but thistles. We seeded all the land, and thistles and melda, they called it. It's like a weed. We cut that all off, and the cattle ate it. They had nothing else to eat. But we made it through. We made it through. Didn't lose our land. A lot of the neighbors lost their land because of that. They couldn't make ends meet and had to move off. But it was luck. We were lucky. And then I was going to go into that. Our dad was early. He went to bed early all the time. Mm-hmm. Every night. He'd go back. The sun was still up. He'd go upstairs and he'd lay in bed. And I would be out there fixing the binder or something, working on something. And one night I heard a noise. I heard him. And my dad was praying. And he prayed every night. He'd go to bed early and he'd pray. And he started with Walter. He said, be with Walter and help him, bless him, and all in German, of course. And then Martha, be with her and bless her and watch over her. And then me. Then I broke up. And then Irene, the youngest one, and I found out that every night he prayed for us. I accidentally heard it. I can't, I can't tell you how it feels when you hear your father or mother quietly in his secret closet praying for you. That's different.
Yeah. Going along the religion line, religion obviously is extremely important to your family and prayer. Did your family ever pray together?
Yes. Uh, Usually on Saturday nights, but more times, other times too. But they'd call it Andacht. That means prayer time. And then he'd read a little scripture out of the Bible to Dad, and then we all knelt down, and the Dad prayed first, then our mother prayed, then Walter prayed, and Martha prayed, and I prayed, and then Irene. And that was a regular devotional time, Saturday night for sure, and other times we did too. But that was something that it seemed like you had to do that, and we got to like it. And then another thing that I've struggled with many times, we had Sunday school all in German, and we couldn't read German as kids. A little, but he'd say, before we go to bed, or before we go for prayer, we're going to read Sunday school. So he'd read one verse, and then my mother would read one verse, and then my brother, he'd stammer and stutter. He couldn't read all of us couldn't read very much German. My sister had the most trouble, my oldest sister. She managed somehow to get through, and then I'd read mine. And we'd always go down, oh, mine is this one. Then I'd practice on that one till my turn came. And then I'd read mine, and then I think the youngest one, I don't think she was in on this yet, because she was too little then. But so we eventually learned to read a little German in a printed form. Handwritten, we couldn't read any of that. But someplace in here, my sister has a little song that somebody wrote in German, and I was surprised that I could read that. I read it in German language.
Did you guys always say? Was the church service always in German?
Yes, it was in the early days, yes. And in about 52 or 53, 54 maybe, the church voted, should we have all English services or part English and part German? And they voted to have it all English. And my dad came out of church and he looked me straight in the eye and he said, even you voted for all English. He watched me. And I said, Dad, it's coming that way. We can't stop it. But then I got nothing, he said. And they'd sit in church. They were there every Sunday. We'd walk out the door and he said, I just had absolutely nothing. He preached in English. I don't know what he said. I have nothing. And that's pathetic. But that's the way the ones who are English and it's in German, they have nothing too. But that's the way it went. But in 52, we got Lauren Wall, Dorothy. we got him. He moved in 52 until 60. Well, from 52 about 54, about 2 years, he preached half English, half German. That was a disaster because his German was not very good. Finally, he said, either we have to vote all English or I have to leave. So we voted all English, and he stayed 6 more years, 7 more years. But, and then Sunday school in the older classes, that stayed German for a long time until, I started teaching when I was 20, and 18 years I had 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. Then I said, I think they're outgrowing me. Well, they said, our young couples class needs a first teacher. Why don't you teach that? Well, these young couples class, they were, for 18 years, we've been sending them on here. And they were here, they were married, some of them to each other and some new ones. But this wasn't too bad. I could teach them pretty good. And then after 18 years, the superintendent or somebody came and said, the head teacher in the upstairs class, the seniors, they need a teacher so bad. Would you go and teach there? And I says, I can't teach German. No, it's going to be all English. But of course my dad had died already. He didn't see that no more. But then I taught English. Oh, they said, we want you to teach English. Teach the senior citizens. I said, I'm not old enough. They said, you have from 50 on, you could be in senior citizen. I'm 49. Oh, come on, they said, that doesn't make no difference. And I started teaching when I was 49 until now I am 80, not quite 84. But from 20 years to 80 is 60, and this fall it'll be 64 years that I've taught Sunday school.
That's a lot of years.
And along with that, it increased my knowledge of what's really in that Bible, because you go around from different lessons, Old Testament, New Testament, and it's been a world of help to me. And I've enjoyed it, although some days it gets to be a chore. Like one day, the pastor and I became good friends. That he started when 52, he started at our church. So he and I'd go hunting Saturdays. We'd come home at night. It's just about sundown. One time we had 18 birds, pheasants and grouse and prairie chicken and ducks. And we came into the parsonage and walked down the basement. He said, okay, to his wife, we shot him, you clean him. She says, have a good time. And she went upstairs. So he and I cleaned those pheasants and ducks and what we had. I went home at 11 or 11:15. I had to go home and study my lesson yet because tomorrow I teach. And he has to preach. And that was a sad day the next day. I was so tired I couldn't hardly keep my eyes open with sticks. And he was tired. But we got through it. Yeah.
Going back a little bit, about 10 years earlier, you'd have been a young adult when Pearl Harbor happened. Do you remember Pearl Harbor?
Oh, sure. Very good.
What do you remember? Do you remember where you were when you heard about it and what you thought about it?
Well, we were home all the time. We didn't get to go too many places. Saturday nights we sometimes got to town. But that was a terrible thing when that happened. And it's not very nice of a Christian to say this, but you can't help but have hate in your heart. That they went in there with just, and at the same time you have to say our people were very negligent. They didn't have patrols watching, and somebody even called in and said, I saw a whole bunch of planes flying. I think they were Japanese planes. Oh, they're probably out on maneuvers. They were coming to Pearl Harbor. And when they got there, they just bombed everything to pieces. There was a fellow that he lived in Lair. He's dead now, but he used to come and sit with us at coffee, and he said, I was there when they came and sunk all our ships. And he said, I jumped overboard on my ship when it blew up. And he says, I was coming towards shore, and another soldier was coming towards shore, and we each had our rifle with us. And he says, one plane came in real low. It was going to machine gun everybody. He says, he came by us real low, and my friend and I, we aimed and both pulled the trigger, and the plane crashed, he said. So they shot one of the planes down. Well, there were more shot down, but he says, my friend and I don't know whether he or I hit him, but he crashed the plane. But those were terrible times. We had a friend that lived in Wishick, and he was in the army, and his name was on the roster later on when we went to visit. There was his name, one of the men that died. Well, that one ship, there were pretty near 3,000 men in that ship, and that blew up, and they were all dead. That was an awful, awful thing. And then the Bible says, love them and forgive them. Can you imagine yourself loving them and forgiving them? That was tough. That was tough.
What did you think about the fact that you were German and we were shortly going to be fighting the Germans during the war?
Well, I was a different German. I was a German that hated the Germans for what they did. And the fact that it was not too popular during World War II to tell anybody you were of German descent. If you went to a big town, somebody found out you're German. But right from the start, I said what Germany did was wrong, and what Hitler did certainly was wrong. And not all the Germans, they were drafted like we were. Not all the Germans were responsible, but they were drafted. They had a gun and they said, shoot. And I had relatives. One fellow, he was from Michigan, and he got captured, and they were shooting at him, and he yelled out in German, don't shoot. I'm also a German. And they finally quit and snuck up on him, and for months they tried to interrogate him that he was a turncoat, that he turned, that he was from Germany and ran over to the other side. He says, no, no one could speak English that well if he was German. He says, my folks couldn't speak a word of English. I learned it in school. He says, my folks came from Germany. And they wouldn't believe it for the longest time. He finally got, and our banker, and he's dead now too, but our banker was caught too. And he talked German to these people, and they said, you've turned over to the other side. No. He says, I come from North Dakota. Most people are German there, he said. And he and a couple of his guys, they got away somehow. At night they slipped out and they got away. But they were very hateful of the German American soldiers that they captured. If you almost had to talk to them to maybe save your life. You say, I'm German too. Then they really got mad. They said, if you're German, why are you fighting us? And all that time during that war, I was not on no Germany side, I'll tell you that. And we were as German as they come.
Did you worry about getting drafted yourself or people you knew getting drafted?
A friend of mine from our church was in the war by France, someplace by Meuse-Argonne area there. And pretty soon word came that he was killed. And then they said, well, where is he? Well, they said he was standing here a minute ago and he's gone. Blew up into a million pieces. That's hard to take. His brother is here. 2 brothers lived here. His dad and mother lived here. Their eldest son blew up, the nicest guy you saw. Nice fellow. And he died.
Did rationing affect your family?
Hmm?
Did the rationing of World War II affect your family?
Yes and no. Yes, we had no truck. And everything had to go through the rationing board. My dad went to the rationing board. They said, we can't ration. It was 41, 42, where the crops were good. We needed a truck. No, they couldn't. And then finally, one of the draft board guys said, how are they going to harvest? We kept his second boy home so he could help with the harvest, and we're saying you can't have a truck. Pretty soon we got a new truck. We had to buy it, of course, but we got a new truck. But I was supposed to be drafted, and one of the rationing board, and I can say that now, this is a long time ago, he was on the board in Ashley. There's 3 people that made the decision. He was one. He was from our church, and he said, I know this family. They have just this one son, and they farm a lot of ground, and they feed a lot of cattle, and they support the war 100%. If we take that son away, how's that father going to run all that? And they finally let me go. I would have been drafted. And my brother had married earlier, 2 years earlier, and then at that time, if you were married and farming, you could get off. But people called us 4Fers and everything else. We were not 4Fers. We were 2C farm workers. 2C was our what we were called rating. But I, as a German, I tell you, I never loved I still have no love for the Germans today in Germany. But I have to, at the same time, you have to say there were people there that couldn't help it. I met a man in Hawaii, of all places. We were in Hawaii, and we talked to 2 couples. And they said, this couple is from Germany. Oh, I said a German word to this one man. Oh, he just lit up. Here's a guy that can talk German. And he talked and talked and talked. But you know what? First thing he said, I was in the war, but I didn't shoot at no American. I was a guard at a plant, and I guarded the plant that nothing happens there. I didn't shoot no American man. And he made sure that I understood that in German. And that might be, then I asked his wife, she talked a good English. I said, how is it you can talk a good English and he can't say a word of English? In fact, the next day, he was on the other side of the street and he saw me and he came running across, just in German, just thought I'd visit with you a little bit more. You know, he was just tickled that he could talk to somebody who can talk German. And but I told him, I said, I have no love for the Germans who killed all those people, and Hitler. Well, most of their men did not like Hitler. They served under him, but they hated him.